Good afternoon. Welcome to our Memorial Scrolls Trust gathering. Welcome to Cleveland and to the Temple-Tifereth, Israel. I'm Susan Ringel, a proud volunteer with the Memorial Scrolls Trust. We're grateful to be together with scroll holders from all over Ohio, from Michigan and Pennsylvania. Special guests, local and from out of town. Here we have survivors, clergy, congregants, teachers, students, young and old. We will begin with a procession of the Torah scrolls, each one a survivor of the Holocaust. We ask that you be silent during the procession. As you are able, please rise. Scroll number 186, Bukovice. Number 123, Chaslav Golchov Yenikov. Number 313, Cheska Budayovetse. .421, Dobrish. .271, Dobrish. .1349, Colleen. .465, Kostelets Nad Orlici. .7, Ledek Nad Sazavo. .404, Melnick. .637, Moravska Ostrava. .206, Golchov Yenikov. .40, Podivin. .183, Praha Pinkas. .749, Praha Smichove. .652, Rodnitsa Nad Laben. .843, Trebich. .94, Vlasim. Special guest, Prague, Alt-New Shul. .40, Orphan Scroll.
Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the strangers in your cities to hear, to learn, to revere Adonai, your God, to observe faithfully the words of this Torah, and let their children who do not yet know it hear that they too may learn to revere Adonai, your God.
Ein kamocha va'elohim Adonai ve'en gemasecha Malechutecha malachut kol olamim Umemshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor Adonai malach Adonai malach Adonai imloch leolam va'ed Adonai oz le'amo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom Avaharachamim heitiv avirtzonecha et Zion Tivnei chamot Yerushalayim Tivnei chamot Yerushalayim Ki vicha levad batachnu Malach Ramanisa Adon Olamim.
In this scroll is the secret of our people's life from Sinai until now. Its teaching is love and justice, goodness and hope. Freedom is its gift to all who treasure it.
Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, Udevar Adonai mirushalayim, Baruch Shanatan Torah, Torah, Baruch Shanatan Torah, Torah, Le'amo Yisrael b'kidushato. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. Gadolul Adonai iti uniromema Shemo yachdav Lecha Adonai agedula v'chagevura v'chatiferet v'chanetzach v'chachod Ki cho b'shamayim uvaretz Ki cho b'shamayim uvaretz Lecha Adonai hamam lecha ve'amid na'aseh lecha lirosh Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lecha kodsho Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lecha kodsho Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, haolam omed. Al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, haolam omed. Al haTorah v'al avodah v'al gemilut chasadim. Al haTorah v'al ha'avodah v'al gemilut chasadim. Al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. Al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. Al haTorah v'al ha'avodah v'al gemilut chasadim. Al haTorah v'al ha'avodah v'al gemilut chasadim. Al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed.
You may be seated.
Friends, as we begin our Torah reading, it is our pleasure to call upon Ed Majesty, the young man who has thought of this, dreamt it, birthed it, and we are honored for him to come forward to lead all of us together in a congregational aliyah as we bless the Torah. Let's join together with Ed.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai.
Amen. Yamdu Bukovice.
Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives seed and bear a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As in the days of impurity of her sickness shall she be unclean."
Yamdu Chaslav Golchu Vyanikov.
וביום השמיני ימעול בשר עולתו.
Yamdu Česky Budějovice.
ו30 יום ו3 ימים תשב בדמי טהרה, בכל קודש לא תיגע, ואל המקדש לא תבוא עד מלות ימי טהרה.
יעמדו דובריש ראשון.
ואם נקבה תלד וטמאה 70 כנידתה ו60 יום ו6 ימים תשב על דמי טהרה. ובמלאת ימי טהרה לבן או לבת תביא כבש בין שנה לעולה ובין יונה או תור לחטאת אל פתח אוהל מועד אל הכהן והקריבו לפני אדוני וכיפר עליה וטהרה.
יעמדו דובריש שני.
ואם נקבה תלד, המקיבש לאמה אתה, שבוע אם כנידתה ו60 יום ו6 ימים תשב על דמי טהרה.
יעמדו קולין. דובריש? יעמדו דובריש.
ובמלאות ימי תורה לבן או לבת תביא כבש בין שנתו לעולה ובין יונה אותו לחטאת אל פתח אוהל מועד אל הכהן.
יעמדו קולין.
והקריבו לפני אדוני וכיפר עליה וטהרה ממקור דמיה. זאת תורת היולדת לזכר או לנקבה.
יעמדו קוצלת נד אורליצ'י.
ואם לא תמצא ידה די שא ולקחה שתי תורים או שני בני יונה, אחד לעולה ואחד לחטאת, וכפר עליה הכהן וטהרה.
יעמדו לדק נד סזבו.
Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe, no wait, that's not the right one. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe el Haron lemor, Adam ki yav besaro seito sapachad ovaheret, v'hayav besaro lenegat sarat, v'huva el Haron hakohen, o el echad mibanav, hakohanim.
Yamdu Melnik.
וראה הכהן את הנגע בעור הבשר ושיער בנגע, הפוך לבן ומראה הנגע עמוק מאור בשרו נגע, צרעת הוא, וראתו הכהן לטימא אותו.
Yamdu Golchuv Yinikov.
ואם בהרת הלבנה היא בעור בשרו ועמוק, אין מראה מן האור, ושערה לא הפך לבן, והסגיר הכהן את הנגע 7 ימים.
Okay. Wait, hold on. We're going to go back. Yamdu Moravska Ostrava.
We're going to reread verse 13:4. Please forgive us here. ואם בהרת לבנה הוא, בעור בשרו ועמוק, אין מראה מן האור, ושערה לא הפך לבן, והסגיר הכהן את הנגע 7 ימים.
Yamdu Podyevin. Yamdu Pracha Pinkas.
V'ra'ah hakohen bayom hashvi'i v'hine hanega omed be'enav lo pasha hanega ba'or hasigiru hakohen 7 yamim shenit.
No.
Ra'ah
No, that's not right again.
וראה הכהן אותו ביום השביעי שנית, והנה כהה הנגע ולא פשע הנגע באור, וטהרו הכהן מספחת הוא, וכיבס בגדיו וטהר, ואם פשע תפשע המספחת באור, אחרי הראתו אל הכהן לטהרתו, ונראה שנית אל הכהן.
וראה הכהן, והנה פסתה המשפחת באור, וטימאו הכהן צרעתי.
יעמדו פרחס מצ'וב,
נגע צרעת כי תהיה באדם והובא אל הכהן. וראה הכהן והנה שאת לבנה בעור, והיא הפכה שיער לבן, ומחית בשר.
יעמדו רודניצה נד לבם,
וראה הכהן, והנה שאש לבץ באור, והיא הקפה שיער לבן, ומחית בשר חי בעת.
יעמדו תרי ביץ',
צרעת נושנת היא באור באור בשרו, וטמאו הכהן לא יסגרנו כי טמא הוא.
יעמדו ולשים, yamdu for all the communities who are unnamed.
ואם פרוח תפרח הצרעת בעור, וכיסתה הצרעת את כל אור הנגע מראשו ועד רגליו, לכל מראה עיני הכהן, וראה הכהן, והנה כיסתה הצרעת את כל בשרו, וטיהר את הנגע כולו.
We join as a community together as Ed leads us chanting in the second bracha.
Baruch atah Adonai,
Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan לנו חברת אמת, וחיי עולם נתן בתוכנו.
Baruch atah Adonai, noti haTorah.
Ladies and gentlemen, with the Torah in our midst and to celebrate the words of our living God, I invite you to please rise.
וזאת התורה אשר שם משה לפני בני ישראל, על פי אדוני ביד את חיים ההיא למחזיקים בה ותומכך מאושר דרכיך דרכי נועם וכל נתיבותיך שלום השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה חדיש חדיש ימינו חדיש ימינו כקדם.
You may be seated. It gives me great pleasure to invite up here our guest speakers. For the moment, let me just say, in introducing them, that we have just experienced a unique event with these Torah scrolls that relate the words of our tradition, of our legacy, from communities that are no more, and that we pray today that our reading from these Torah scrolls and our celebration of these Torah scrolls will advance the legacy of our Torah and the life of Torah for generations to come in memory of those who are no longer with us. And so it gives me great pleasure to invite our guest speakers to the podium.
It's my pleasure to introduce Lois Roman, a trustee of the Memorial Scrolls Trust, who serves as a U.S. representative based on the East Coast. I'm thrilled to meet Lois in person after almost 3 years of seeing her on Zoom. Lois's passion for and knowledge about the scrolls, I'm sure, will intrigue you and inspire you. Lois.
Thank you, Susan. Also my pleasure to meet you in person. You're taller than I thought. And I'm not so tall, so I hope you can see me over the podium here. I purposefully put this beautiful light here in front of you, so while I'm making my remarks, I just want your eyes to follow the flame a little bit, because while today was so beautiful, with all of these Torah scrolls marching down the aisle, they are but a minuscule remembrance of the loss that we suffered as a Jewish people in the Holocaust. So this is the light for everyone else. On behalf of the Memorial Scrolls Trust, I want to thank Susan for inviting me. I want to thank Ed Majesty and Susan Koleski and everyone here at the temple for working so hard to put this together. I had the honor of just flying in this morning and doing the speech. They did all the hard work. Today we're going to talk about Torah scrolls, the most revered item in Judaism and the greatest storybook ever. Whether we define ourselves as Reform, Conservative, Orthodox Jews, or any other style, whether we live in Cleveland, or New York, or Rome, or Yemen, or Russia, we all read the same words out of these Torah scrolls. It's the glue that binds us together as the Jewish people. It also binds the major religions of the world together. The Torah scroll is the Old Testament in Christianity, and it's one of the 5 books in Islam. Recently, Jews around the world celebrated the holiday of Pesach, commemorating the deliverance of the Jewish people from Egyptian bondage into freedom, an event which happened thousands of years ago. And we also held this week the much more modern commemoration of Yom HaShoah, the Remembrance Day for the 6 million lost in the Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis. That occurred only 80 years ago. We have no tangible objects from the Passover story with which to retell it in our homes. So we wrote the Haggadah, which we read at the Seder table. We eat matzah for a week. We taste the charosis, and we clear our sinuses with horseradish. But for the Holocaust, we do have objects that we can touch and see that did survive, and some of them are in front of you today. I will spend the next few minutes talking about the ancestry and the amazing story of survival of these Czech scrolls. Let's first start with geography. Our story will focus on the lands around the current-day big cities of Prague and Brno in the Czech Republic. These areas were originally the ancient kingdoms of Bohemia and Moravia. As a memory booster for those of you that haven't been in school for a while, these areas are in Central Europe, surrounded on the west by Germany, on the south by Austria, and the east by Poland. There were 1,000 years of Jewish history in these lands before World War II. The Jews were alternatively invited in and kicked out over the centuries, invited in to serve as bankers and to provide tax revenue for the landowners, and kicked out when the new rulers displayed unfettered anti-Semitism. After the Jews were given the right of citizenship in the Czech area in the mid-19th century, Jewish life blossomed, and Jews spread to more than 300 little towns and cities all over Bohemia and Moravia. Most of the Jews adopted Reform Judaism from Germany. They spoke German or Czech, not Yiddish. They felt nationalistic pride and fought for the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. They wore fashions of the times, they sent their children to secular schools, and they intermarried with their Czech and German neighbors. Anti-Semitism was somewhat muted, and the Jews held prominent positions in business, education, and politics. After World War I, the country of Czechoslovakia was created from the merger of these lands and the country of Slovakia. In Germany, the Nazi Party was gaining momentum, and the Jewish community was watching with increasing fear. Many Jews were able to leave to come here to the United States or to Palestine, but about 118,000 Czech Jews remained. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Bohemia and Moravia on their way to Poland, thus starting World War II. I could go on and on about World War II history or Holocaust history in general, but that's not why you brought me here today. Instead, let me tell you the story of how it came to pass that these Torah scrolls survived. And I'm going to frame that story in 4 miracles. Miracle number 1, the collection. Under the Nazi occupation, the Jewish community of Prague was forced to send a letter to all of the smaller Jewish congregations requesting their silver objects and ancient manuscripts. Not the Torah scrolls, the ancient manuscripts from the libraries all over this area. In an act of resistance and heroism, the Jews manipulated the Nazis into collecting all of the immovable Judaica in the land. More than 200,000 objects were sent to Prague, cataloged at the Jewish Museum, and put away in storage in the old synagogues in the city. This coincided with the Jewish deportations to Terezin, the concentration camp outside of Prague. From there, the Jews were sent on to the death camps. The curators at the museum worked feverishly under horrible conditions to save as much as they could before they themselves were sent to the camps. Miracle number 2. Only 1 bomb fell on Prague during all of the war. It was an American bomber who was lost. Thought he was dropping the bomb on Dresden and dropped it on Prague instead, but be that as it may. This meant that the Judaica collection survived intact. Unfortunately, Czech Jewry was decimated. Only 15% of Czech Jews returned to the lands and survived the Holocaust. In an amazing development, one of the curators of the museum and one of the collectors of the Judaica survived, came back to Prague, and was again at the helm of the museum archives. By 1948, communism came to these lands. She convinced the communist government to allow her to move the Torah scrolls from the center of Prague to the abandoned Mikli synagogue in the outskirts. And there they stayed until the early 1960s. Miracle number 3. Strapped for cash, the communist government was looking for assets to sell. What better moneymaker than a collection of useless religious artifacts? A deal was made between a London art collector, his client, and the government, and the scrolls were sold. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, 2 trucks pulled up outside the Westminster Synagogue in Knightsbridge, London. The congregants unloaded the trucks and were eager to see what was inside the 1,564 giant gray bags that came off the truck. When they began to open the bags, they were shocked. Inside were Torah scrolls which were burnt, had bullet holes, had blood stains. They even found notes inside that said, "Please remember us." Miracle number 4. This was a project far greater than one investor or one synagogue. The predecessor of the Memorial Scrolls Trust began. The trust fixed as many of the scrolls as possible and sent them all around the world on permanent loan to synagogues and schools and museums and libraries. Currently, there are 1,400 scrolls in circulation. Our collection dates from the 1200s to the early 20th century. All of the scrolls were collected in the Czech lands, and many have special Kabbalistic writing and ornaments on the letters, not found anywhere else. All of the scrolls you see here today have this shared legacy, but each also has a unique backstory, written for a specific Jewish community in a small town or a large city that was lost in the Shoah. Today is not just a reunion of Torah scrolls. It is a commemoration of dozens of lost Jewish communities that were vibrant and active before the Holocaust. In the 21st century, the eyewitnesses and survivors of the Holocaust are passing on. Who will tell the story of the Holocaust to future generations? The Holocaust was the largest tragedy of the Jewish people in our time. We have an obligation to retell the story in the same way we retell the Passover story. We have an opportunity to use these scrolls, which are themselves survivors of the Shoah, to teach future generations. The Memorial Scrolls Trust Czech Torah collection underwent a similar experience to the Jews in the Holocaust. They were collected in a concentrated area, they were numbered and cataloged, they were kept in bad conditions, and their health deteriorated. Unlike the Jews, most of the scrolls survived. Now it's their turn to play a role in retelling the Holocaust story. We can and should use these Torah scrolls for this purpose. So, I challenge all of you to embrace Holocaust education and tell the story of the Holocaust to your family members, to future generations, to your friends, to your neighbors, so the legacy of these 6 million murdered Jews is never lost and the events of the Holocaust are never repeated. L'dor v'dor, from generation to generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lois. I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Cole, who specializes in modern Europe and Germany, specifically the history of Nazism and the Holocaust and Jewish studies, as well as the histories of consumption and food more generally.
So Lois is going to be a tough act to follow. You couldn't see it up here, but she was on her tiptoes for the entire introduction of that. Thank you very much for inviting me, Rabbi Cohen. I have to thank Ed for giving me the impossible task of providing some sort of context for the beauty that we witnessed today, but also the tragedy, the historical tragedy, the context that surrounds that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some aspects of what makes today possible. And the topic of my talk today is a term called Aryanization, but also the looting and plunder, the attempt to erase Jewish existence. And I want to emphasize the point, the attempt at the beginning. Thinking about the Third Reich and why we are here today, I invite you to think of the Nazi regime not simply as a dictatorship, but as a kleptocracy. Part of what it wanted to do was to take, by any means necessary, the things it needed to fill its political, economic, and ideological goals. Put simply, it was willing to steal whatever it needed to do that. And this was part of a much, much larger plan, a plan that, of course, targeted Europe's Jews, a plan that sought to annihilate them both physically but also culturally. And this is one of the things that's sort of often forgotten in the Shoah. Part of the eradication of the people also meant the eradication of certain aspects or most of their culture, so that if they could wipe out the culture, they could then rewrite the narrative, and they could make that narrative say exactly what they wanted if there were no Jews to stand up and tell their history. This was all part of Hitler's larger sort of worldview, his ideology, his Weltanschauung in German. And if we read Mein Kampf, there's an important part of one chapter where he is, actually it's one of the more lucid parts of the text. Most of it, of course, is garbage. But he suggests that humanity is divided up into three ways. And when he talks about Jews, he refers to them as the destroyers of culture. There are the culture creators, the Germans, of course, Aryans. There are those who simply just sort of ride along on the coattails. For Hitler, that was Asians. They never invented anything. And then those who physically destroy culture, those who, by their very nature, dilute culture. And as we think about this in the larger context of Nazi ideology, the Nazis and Hitler sought to use the Jews for what they were useful for, economic gain in particular, but also while pushing aside cultural importance, cultural improvements, and cultural sort of motivations, I think is a good word to put it as well. And the way this sort of played out in the history was that the Nazis sought to take from the Jews in three specific ways, in what I would sort of call phases. This attempt to culturally as well as economically impoverish, at first, German Jews, but then that will also, of course, be exported to all of those places during the war, which the Nazis will come to take over. Economic impoverishment began long before the Nazis even took power. In 1923, 10 years before the Nazi seizure of power, the fledgling group that would come to be known as the Nazis were known to, and Adolf Hitler was known to, send his thugs out to target Jewish banks to try to get money, a decade before they were in power. This is what I would call the sort of street legal phase, the street level phase. Also, between 1933 and 1938, there are these, as this image up here suggests, there are these countless, and we don't know how many they are, what I would call shakedowns of German Jews who, when stopped in the streets, when given a hard time, are relieved of their valuables, we might say. We're then going to see a series of laws that are passed, which are going to make it possible at the state, the German state, and then at the national level, and they worked often in very different ways and not always seamlessly, so that they could take what I would call quasi-legally Jewish property. And then in the wartime, we're going to see that be expanded to outright theft, plunder. And it's made much more easy under the cover of war. This is done first and foremost through what the Germans called Aryanization. Aryanization technically is the legal definition would be the transfer of Jewish-owned property to Aryans. And this was done, depending on time and place, in very different ways. Between 1933 and 1938, this was done at a rather slow pace. Historians estimate about 1/5 of transfers of Jewish property, meaning actual land or businesses, were done at what I would call a fair market value. This was often friends, business associates who had said, look, I don't think things are going to get any better. You ought to get out now while you can. And so they might sell their property, they might sell their business, and they might get a decent price for it. About 40% of Aryanization happened at what I would call bargain basement prices. That is the state or the legal minimum for which these properties were valued, and of course they were valued by the Nazis. And the Nazis often valued Jewish property at only 20 to sometimes 30% of its actual value. So when they took it, they were taking it at a fraction of what it was really worth. After 1938, 1938 is this pivotal year, this year of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. This is also a pivotal year in Aryanization because this is when it becomes hard law that Jews are no longer allowed to own any property or own or run any businesses. And this is when the full force of the Nazi regime comes behind this. And it's via pressure, blackmail, in which Jews are forced to sell. And after 1938, there are no Jewish-owned businesses or Jewish-run businesses in Germany. And this moment is a really important moment for exploitation of Jews. And it's not just, and I want to emphasize, this isn't just business or actual land properties. Some of the newest research out shows that there is also a very keen attempt to push Jews out of Germany early on. And it got to such a frenzied pace that you can see in the picture here. This looks like a flea market or an auction that you might go to. And here, another one. We now know that there are almost daily, for example, in the city of Hamburg, auctions in which they were auctioning off Jewish belongings, everyday Jewish belongings, pots, pans, tables, furniture, all of these sorts of things. And you know, this is quite a different picture than I think when we think about plunder, when we think about loot. We think about high art, for example, the really sort of expensive stuff. But much of the Nazi economy was driven by everyday goods as well. And of course, this also suggests that everyday Germans, ordinary Germans, played a role in this because they were the ones who were there buying this stuff up. I might also encourage you to think about that great art, that high culture, the sort of monuments men stuff that we come to know, the missing, Da Vinci's and these sorts of things. And I wanted to bring up a name today that isn't usually on most people's radar. Not one of the highest level ranking Nazis. And this is why it's so important for when we think about history, we don't just think about the people at the top, but we think about the sort of what I would call second tier or third tier bureaucrats, the lower level functionaries. Cajetan Mühlmann was an Austrian. He's an art historian. And when the Nazis annexed Austria in the mid-1930s, he becomes very, very useful as he's going to be the sort of Nazi man in charge for looking over Europe and taking what it wants. Mühlmann is so important. Some historians have argued he is the greatest art thief of all time in all of human history. He is the one who orchestrates by creating these plundering commandos of going around to the various places that the Germans had occupied and going through the collections, going through the holdings, and taking what they want. And of course, the opposite side, the contrast of this, is trying to make Jewish art, Jewish culture less important by labeling it degenerate, by suggesting that it is not needed. The Nazis were very willing to buy it up, and if it had some value, they were willing to sell it, most definitely, in which they did. But the idea was to export that away and to create their own sort of narrative. Mullmann is so important because he not only oversees the Viennese collection, the taking of the Austrian Jewish Viennese collection, he also goes through occupied Poland with his commandos, as well as in the Netherlands. What he takes is, on the face of it, supposed to be what is going to be Hitler's great dream of creating the Führer's Museum in Linz, Austria, his hometown. He imagines, and this never became a reality, but the idea was to create a collection that would be unrivaled in the world in Linz. Hitler himself had 8,000 to 9,000 paintings in his possession. To give you some idea, some of the biggest collections in the world, some of the biggest museums in the world have 2,000, 2,700. So he himself and all of the top Nazis were kleptocrats. They took what they wanted. They all had artistic taste, and they had very, very high expectations of what they could get. Maybe the most famous painting from Mullmann that was taken was a Raphael. This was taken from Poland. This comes from the Czartoryski collection. This is the most famous painting that was taken and has never been recovered. We don't have any sort of evidence for what happened for it. We believe it still exists, that it is somewhere, and current estimates suggest it's in the $400 to $500 million range in value. So very, 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 very valuable for many people, all involved. One of the other things that we don't think about often when we think about the looting, plunder, theft, the kleptocracy, is also the Nazis stole millions of books. They went into libraries, Judaica collections, and they took them and gathered them. Usually when we think about Nazis, we think about burning books, but we know that they kept, cataloged, and had stolen millions and millions and millions of volumes for an attempt to create, again, to catalog, to create this master narrative in which they write themselves as the progenitor of and the most important catalyst in. This image here comes from Estonia, where they've taken a collection and are now going through it. I'd like to end today by emphasizing the beauty of what we've seen here today, and this beauty is a reminder that in the end, while the Nazis wanted to eradicate Jews and Jewish culture from the face of the earth, what we are experiencing, what we are seeing right now is ultimately the maybe best antidote to that. This is what we see as a success. The history was not changed. The narrative was not ultimately changed. We see billions of dollars worth of property, of artifacts of all kinds still missing, but we're slowly finding the rightful owners and giving them this stuff back, whether it's artistic pieces, whether it's property, or what have you. This thriving of Jewish life, both in the United States, in Europe, and around the world, is this last great testament. So thank you very much.
And now we will hear from one of Cleveland's treasures, Erika Taubner-Gold. Erika was born in 1932 in Budapest, Hungary. When she was 5 months old, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. After the Soviet Union liberated Hungary, Gold was able to reunite with her father. She eventually traveled to Cuba in 1948, then the US in 1950, finally making her way to Cleveland.
done? Yeah, okay, thank you. And I'm really honored to be invited today to this very important ceremony. I'm really awed. They are so beautiful. And when I was asked to speak, I decided to research the little town that my grandparents lived in. The town's name is Galanta, and it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And after the First World War, it became Czechoslovakia. Then in 1938, the Hungarians got the space back, and it was Hungary. After the Second World War, it became Czechoslovakia. So I was always wondering if any of their Torahs were saved. Because during the Holocaust, it was Hungary. But anyway, so I found out that yes, at least one that I was able to research is in Williamsburg, New York. So it's being used, and I saw a ceremony where they dedicated the Torah, and it was a really nice thing to know that they did survive. I have no idea how many Torahs they actually had. There were two big Orthodox synagogues, although it was a really small town. And there was a yeshiva. It was a very important place because there were 300 boys, and it was known by the Jewish community. But the rest of the world knew of the town because Kodai wrote a piece, Galanta Dances. So it was a real town, but it was very small. As I've been reading the research, which I didn't know before, there were 1,620 Jews that were deported June 26, 1944, from Galanta, and 272 survived. For my recollection, they did not go back to Galanta because there were maybe just 5, 6 people that I know of that actually returned. There were no families because all the women, children, and old people were murdered. So anyway, so that's about the Torah. Now, I was fortunate because I lived in Budapest, and that gave me a slim chance of surviving. And my grandparents lived, Galanta was like 2 hours north of Budapest on the Slovak border, so it wasn't that far. But by July 1st, all the small towns and villages in Hungary were completely cleared out of all the Jews. There wasn't anywhere except in Budapest. So that's how I had the slim chance of surviving. It was a bigger city. They had a harder time, I guess, getting us together, but they managed. But to go back, excuse me, I'm sorry, but I double booked myself, and I was talking to the religious school this morning, so my voice is kind of gone. Anyway, so the Germans occupied Hungary the 19th of March, 1944. By the 1st of April, we all had to wear a yellow star. And people were always very optimistic. They figured, no big deal, we wear a yellow star. But it was a big deal because all the laws that came out were for the people who wore the yellow star. They could do this, or they can't do that, had to do this, whatever. So the first thing, early April, my grandfather sent a message that they have to move out of that house, move in with another family, and he said, as long as they leave a roof over our heads, we'll be okay. So then we didn't hear from them for a long time. At the same time, for the rest of the country, they said non-Jews could not work for Jewish people. So we had a housekeeper at our apartment who was not Jewish. She had to leave, get her own apartment where she lived with her daughter my age. My dad had a clerk in his store who was not Jewish. He had to leave, but that didn't make any difference because my dad had to close the store and report to a forced labor camp. So I'm an only child, so my mother and I were alone in the apartment. And in July 1st, as I mentioned, since all the other people were gone, they started to gather us. So they designated certain buildings where Jews could live, and other buildings were off limits. The building we lived in was off limits, and we moved in with my mother's aunt, whose building was okay, acceptable for Jews. I'm sorry. So anyway, at that point, we could only go out on the street like 2 hours a day to buy the most important fruits and vegetables that was available for Jews. We couldn't get anything else. Jews were not allowed meat or flour or sugar, no dairy products. I received 2 ounces of milk a week because I was under the age of 12. So that wasn't too much nourishment. So my mother took me every day to the market, and we bought fresh fruits and vegetables, and that's what we lived on. So then in October 15th, a new regime came in. The Arrow Cross took over. They were even meaner than the other Nazis, but they're going to take care of the rest of us. By the way, what I forgot to mention, because of the transports, that so many Jews were eliminated in such a short period of time. It was less than 2 months. There was an exhibit at the Motz Museum, 2016, about Adolf Eichmann, who was the architect, one of the architects of the final solution. He was in charge of the transports, and he was very good at what he was doing. So in November 1944, the German government gave him a plaque that we had at the museum next door, and it said it honored him for being so efficient and transporting 400,000 Hungarian Jews to the camp in less than 2 months. So it's not my word, it's theirs. So anyway, we're back in October. By that time, most of the men of working age were in some kind of a camp situation or with the army. So there were no men in Budapest that was working age, women, children, and old people. So they decided they start with the women of working age, and they called all these women up to report to a big sporting arena. My mother was that age group, so she had to go. And because of the fact the Nazis wrote everything down, I mean, I didn't write the history, they did. They had to record everything, and everybody had to have some kind of a paper that they registered. And I happen to have one of my uncle, but it's a very neat paper, handwritten with a lot of information. So by the end of the day, the Nazis were not finished registering everybody. So they said anybody who's not registered can go home and they'll be called another time. So fortunately, my mother was not registered. So she was able to come home, but she said she's not going back there. She'll have to think of something else to do. So she found out that there was a factory near Budapest that was making soldier uniforms. And if we get in there, they'll save us, like the Schindler's List, although we didn't know about the Schindler's List. But anyway, it was important for the war effort, so they figured, they needed help. So we were fortunate, we got in there. We worked during the day in the factory. At night, we slept on the factory floor on the soldier uniforms. And that's how we existed. We were not allowed to go anywhere out of there. So while we were there, and I have the date of the place where when they gave us the paper, it was the 14th of November, 1944. So we just worked there. While we were there, my dad sent a message that he's going to be taken away from the forced labor camp where he was. That was a Shell oil refinery. And of course, nobody ever knew where they were going. At that point, my mother found out that there were neutral country diplomats in Budapest trying to save the remaining Jews of Europe because we were it. And there was a Swiss government and a Swedish, and they were giving out protective papers. So my mother got a paper for my dad from the Swiss government. The gentleman who was in charge was Charles Lutz, and he was able to get this paper. We didn't know if it arrived or if it did any good, because not all the Nazis accepted that as fact. So we're still working in the factory, and as I said, we got there about the 14th of November. The 1st of December, the Nazis came and took us all away. There were 300 women and children in this group, and some of us were on trucks, other people were walking around Budapest, of course, not knowing where we're gonna end up. It was a Friday afternoon, and it was getting dusk when we arrived to this very busy marketplace where people were doing their weekend shopping. The Nazis said, we're going to stop here. Nobody should get out of line or get off the trucks. With that, the truck that my mother and I were on stopped. She jumped off, she winked at me, I jumped after her, and we walked away. Obviously, nobody saw us or cared. By that time, we knew where our housekeeper lived. Her name was Ilonka Takács. We had a very good relationship with her, thank God. She was a wonderful person, and she was a hero. We went there and asked her if we could come in for a couple days till my mother figures out what else we could do. Of course, there was no place to go, and she was a hero, and she kept us there. If anybody would have found out that we are there and she's saving us, all 4 of us would have been shot. So it was a big deal. Anyway, so we stayed there, and nobody knew that we were there because she used to have her sister just drop in, and we had to either jump under the beds, or she had a little closet like this in the kitchen, and that's where we had to stay motionless until her sister left, because she didn't trust her sister enough to let her know that we're there. Fortunately, 15th of January 1945, the Red Army came in and liberated us, which was, we were very happy, but we didn't go outside. Then a miracle happened 3 days later. My dad came and found us. And that's when we found out that so-called Schutzpass from the Swiss government got to him. He was already in the cattle car. The Nazi called him out and let him go. By that time, there was a ghetto in Budapest, and that's where my dad spent the remaining time. So that was a real miracle that all three of us stayed alive. So after that, we went, what happened is the Pest is on the east side. That's where the army was coming from, and they liberated the Pest side first, and then the Germans blew up all the bridges on the Danube. So it took the Red Army another 30 days before they could liberate the whole city. But on the Pest side, we were able to get around because it was liberated. There were no Nazis, at least that they talked about. And we could go back to our old apartment, hoping that it's available, that nobody took it over. So as it turned out, it was the top floor of a big apartment building, and nobody wanted to live in the top floor or anything. So it was left exactly how we left it in July. Nobody went in there, nobody touched anything. What we left there was still there. The only problem was that all the windows were broken because all the bombs. We forgot to close one window, happened to be in the bathroom. My parents pulled in one of these pull-out couches. They slept on that, and I slept in the bathtub. We had no food, no gas, no electricity, no running water, but we were free. And when you're free, things get better, and people were coming back. As the Red Army was going west, the Allies were coming east. They liberated the different towns and countries, including the concentration camps. And when the people started coming back from the concentration camps is when we actually found out all the horrible, horrible things that happened there, and all the people that we can't expect to come back. So after, we didn't want to stay in Europe already before. My parents asked for a visa in 1936 to come to the United States. But our number wasn't even close to even after the Holocaust. So in 1948, my dad found out that the Cuban government is selling visas, and if we go to Cuba, we're out of Europe and closer to the United States. Fortunately, my parents didn't know about the St. Louis. But anyway, we did go to Cuba, and we were safe. It took another 2 years before we were able to come to the United States. And thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the Mourners' Kaddish. Please join me. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה. בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי. בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל. בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה. תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירם בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו amen. May the source of peace and comfort and ongoing life send peace and comfort and ongoing life to us for many generations to come, and let us say together, amen.
Seated. This song, this story was written by A.B. Rotenberg. The story or the song is not told to you by a person, but rather it is sung to you by a Torah. And today, this song is sung to you by this Torah that belongs to the Temple-Tifereth Israel, a Torah we refer to as the orphan scroll, for it has no community that we know it is attached to. This is called The Place Where I Belong. I was made way back in 1842 by a humble man, a real God-fearing Jew, who did his work with honesty, with feeling and with pride. He was known in town as Yankala the scribe. With loving hands, his hand so sure and still, he formed me with some parchment, ink, and quill. Each day he'd slowly add to me just a few more lines, with words to last until the end of time. And on the day that I was finally complete, the whole town came and filled the narrow street. And they sang and danced and held me high as they carried me away to the little wooden shul where I would stay. And as the rabbi held me close against his chest, he spoke out loud and clear to all the rest. He said, no matter if you're very young or even if you're old, live by the words you'll find inside this scroll. 3 days a week they read from me out loud. It filled my soul with joy. It made me proud. They followed each and every verse with fire in their eyes, the words that told them how to live their lives. I watched the generations come and go. I saw the old ones die, their children grow. But never in a century did I miss my turn once, for the parents, they had left me with the young. But the hatred from the west came to our town, and they rounded up the Jews who were around. But Moishelah the shamus, he was brave and he was bold. He hid me in his cellar, dark and cold. And for years and years I waited all alone for the people of the town to take me home. And they'd sing and dance and hold me high as they carried me away to my little wooden shul where I would stay. But it was someone else who found my hiding place. And to America they sent me in a crate. And the men who took me off the boat, they said I was a prize. But they were Jews I did not recognize. And in a case of glass they put me on display, where visitors could look at me and say, how very nice, how beautiful, a stunning work of art. But they knew not what was in my heart. And across the room I saw upon the shelf some old friends of mine who lived back in my town. A silver pair of candlesticks, a menorah made of brass. We'd all become mere echoes of the past. So if you hear my voice, why don't you come along and take me to the place where I belong, and maybe even sing and dance when you carry me away to some little wooden shul where I could stay. And as the rabbis hold me close against their chest, they'll speak out loud and clear to all the rest. They'll say, no matter if you're very young or even if you're old, live by the words you'll find inside this scroll. Live by the words you'll find inside my soul.
Friends, thank you so much for joining us today for this special service. Thank you to all of those who organized and participated in the service, and especially Ed Majesty, whose idea this was and who saw this to this magnificent fruition. This 1.5 dozen scrolls are going to remain here for this moment, and I encourage you to come close, to take a look at them, and to see what we have here before us. Please do not bring any food and drink into the sanctuary and anywhere near the scrolls. And please join us at the Oneg outside. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Friends, one more thing. February 4th will be the 60th anniversary of the rescue of these scrolls at the Westminster Synagogue, and everyone is welcome to join an event that will take place on February 4th with their scrolls.